August 12th, 1944. A sweltering summer afternoon near Argentown, Normandy. Sergeant Major Kurt Becker of the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, found himself crouched behind the shattered remains of a Norman farmhouse, the stench of cordite and pulverized stone filling the air. For days, his men had been attempting to extricate themselves from what the Anglo-Americans were now calling the Falaise Pocket, a rapidly tightening noose of steel and fire. Becker, a veteran of the Eastern Front, a recipient of the Iron Cross, understood desperation. He'd seen it in the frozen forests outside Moscow, in the scorched earth of Kursk. But this was different. This was a gnawing, insidious dread that seeped into the very bone, far removed from the romanticized ferocity he had been taught to expect from warfare. His Panzerfaust, the single-shot, recoilless anti-tank weapon, was effective, undeniably. But it was also crude, a desperate answer to a question the Wehrmacht had never fully anticipated: how to reliably counter an enemy that seemed to produce tanks and armored vehicles as effortlessly as Germany produced propaganda. Becker peered through a crack in the wall. The American Sherman tanks were advancing, their 75mm guns spitting death. He counted 5, then 6. Suddenly a flash of orange, a roar, and the lead Sherman, a behemoth designated Boston Brawler, shuddered, then erupted into a geyser of flame and shrapnel. A direct hit, but it wasn't the familiar deafening concussion of a high-velocity anti-tank round or the sharp crack of a Panzerfaust. This was different. The second Sherman also took a hit, its track mangled, bringing it to a grinding halt. From the hedgerows, a mere 70 yards away, Becker saw them. 2 American GIs, not much older than the youngest recruits in his own squad, reloading a peculiar open-ended tube nearly 5 feet long, carried by one, aimed by the other. It was clumsy, almost theatrical in its operation, yet undeniably lethal. This, he realized with a cold knot in his stomach, was the bazooka. He had heard rumors, vague intelligence reports from a few captured soldiers, but seeing it in action was another matter entirely. The weapon, officially the M1A1 rocket launcher, was crude yet effective, and its presence in such numbers spoke volumes. The Germans, with their sophisticated engineering and meticulous designs, had perfected the anti-tank rifle, then the Panzerschreck, a heavier, more complex recoilless weapon directly inspired by the bazooka. But the bazooka itself, in its simple, almost brutalist design, was an expression of something else entirely, a philosophy of mass production, of overwhelming accessible firepower. It was, in the words of one incredulous German officer captured that week, a tool of victory, as primitive as it is devastating. This seemingly simple device, born of an urgent need and a distinctly American approach to industrial warfare, would become a symbol of the immense disparity in resources and production capabilities that ultimately decided the fate of the Third Reich. It was a war of ideologies, yes, but beneath the surface, it was also a war of sheer tonnage, of steel and gunpowder, produced on a scale that rendered German ingenuity, for all its brilliance, tragically insufficient. The story of the bazooka, and indeed the broader tale of Allied industrial might, is a narrative woven with threads of desperation, ingenuity, and a profound misunderstanding on the part of the Axis powers about the true nature of their enemy. When Hitler's legions rolled across Europe, they did so with a force and speed that shattered conventional military thought. The Blitzkrieg, a doctrine of rapid, mechanized assault, was a triumph of quality over quantity, precision over brute force. Germany's tanks, the early PZK PFW-3s and IVs, were superior to many of their adversaries. Their aircraft, the Messerschmitts and Stukas, dominated the skies. But this early success masked a fatal flaw. Germany's industrial base, though formidable, was finite, and crucially, it was geared towards quality, towards bespoke engineering, rather than the relentless, almost vulgar churn of mass production. The Wehrmacht entered the war with approximately 3,500 tanks and armored vehicles. By the time the United States entered the conflict in December 1941, it possessed around 400 tanks, a stark contrast, yet one that would be brutally inverted within a mere 3 years. The American approach to warfare was, in many ways, the antithesis of the German. It was about overwhelming force, about swamping the enemy not just with superior tactics, but with an endless tide of material. This wasn't necessarily a conscious strategy from the outset, but rather a reflection of America's unique industrial capacity and its isolation from the immediate threat of war. While Europe was locked in a life-and-death struggle, American factories were already titans, honed by decades of consumer production. The automobile industry, in particular, would prove to be the sleeping giant. Henry Ford, a figure both revered and reviled for his industrial innovations, had perfected the assembly line, a process that could be adapted from churning out Model Ts to churning out tanks, jeeps, and, crucially, the very weapons that would equip an army of millions. The Germans, even as they conquered nations, never quite grasped the implications of this industrial potential. They saw America as a soft, materialistic nation, obsessed with jazz and Hollywood, incapable of matching their disciplined, ideologically driven war machine. This was a fatal miscalculation, one that would become painfully apparent to men like Kurt Becker in the hedgerows of Normandy. The bazooka, then, was not just a weapon. It was a physical manifestation of this industrial philosophy, a symbol of what America could do when its vast economic engine was fully engaged. It was cheap to produce, relatively simple to operate, and effective enough to give the average GYA fighting chance against a panzer. The irony was palpable. The nation that prided itself on its technological sophistication would ultimately be suffocated by an enemy whose genius lay in making things fast and making them many. The genesis of the bazooka itself is a testament to wartime improvisation and the often unforeseen convergences of scientific discovery and military necessity. By late 1941, as American forces prepared to enter the global conflict, a critical vulnerability was identified. Their infantry lacked an effective portable weapon to counter enemy armor. The anti-tank rifle, a standard infantry weapon in many armies, was largely ineffective against the thicker armor of modern tanks. Meanwhile, the German panzer grenadiers and other assault units often relied on satchel charges or magnetic mines, dangerous and close-range methods that often resulted in heavy casualties. American ordnance engineers, working under intense pressure, began exploring alternatives. One promising avenue came from the work of Dr. Robert H. Goddard, the father of modern rocketry, whose pre-war experiments with rocket propulsion suddenly found a terrifying new application. Concurrently, a young Army colonel named Leslie Skinner, a ballistic expert, was grappling with the challenge of creating a weapon that could fire a shaped charge, a specialized explosive designed to penetrate armor without the need for a heavy, complex artillery piece. The shaped charge, a German invention dating back to the late 19th century, focuses the explosive energy into a narrow, high-velocity jet of material, capable of punching through thick steel. The problem was how to deliver this charge effectively and safely by a single infantryman. Skinner's team, working in secrecy, experimented with launching small rockets. The breakthrough came when Lieutenant Edward Uhl suggested an open-ended tube, a simple metal pipe from which to fire these rockets. The design was primitive, almost comically so. The first prototypes were literally built from scavenged parts, including a discarded stovepipe. An initial test involved firing a shaped charge from the makeshift tube at a 1/4-inch armor plate. The projectile punched right through, leaving a neat, smoking hole. The potential was immediately recognized. General George C. Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, witnessed a demonstration and was reportedly so impressed that he ordered immediate production. The weapon quickly earned its nickname Bazooka, from a popular musical instrument of the era, invented by comedian Bob Burns, which was a long, telescoping brass tube. The resemblance was uncanny. Yet for all its revolutionary potential, The early bazooka was far from perfect. It was temperamental, prone to misfires, and its rocket exhaust posed a significant danger to the operator and anyone standing too close behind. Its effective range was limited, forcing infantrymen into perilously close engagements with enemy armor. Sergeant Frank Gorski, a veteran of the North African campaign, recounted in his memoirs the terrifying calculus of a bazooka attack. You had maybe 50 yards, tops, to get a good shot. Any closer, and you were in the tank's machine gun sights. Any further, and the rocket just drifted. It was a hell of a gamble every time. Despite these drawbacks, its impact was immediate and profound. It gave the American infantrymen a tangible answer to the Panzer, a psychological boost as much as a tactical one. No longer were they merely targets for enemy tanks. They were now hunters, capable of striking back. The first combat use of the bazooka occurred during Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa, in November 1942. Its appearance startled the German and Italian forces. Initial reports from bewildered Axis soldiers described a secret American weapon that fired exploding bullets capable of destroying tanks. The psychological effect was arguably as significant as the physical damage. German tank crews, who had previously felt invulnerable, now had to contend with the unsettling possibility of an infantryman hidden in a ditch or behind a wall, carrying a weapon that could penetrate their armor. This fear forced them to alter their tactics, to be more cautious, to advance with greater infantry support. All factors that slowed down their operations and chipped away at their tactical superiority. But the true revelation for the Germans came not just from the bazooka's individual lethality, but from the sheer volume in which it began to appear. This wasn't a rare experimental weapon. It was a standard issue, being mass-produced on a scale that Germany simply could not match. The quantitative disparity between the Allied and Axis war machines began to manifest itself in ways that transcended mere battlefield encounters. It was a war fought on the assembly lines as much as in the trenches. While Germany prioritized precision and quality, often producing fewer, more advanced weapons, the Allies, particularly the United States, embraced an ethos of overwhelming production. Consider the statistics. In 1942, the first full year of America's war effort, the United States produced 23,880 tanks. In that same year, Germany produced 4,200. By 1943, American tank production soared to 29,497, while German output reached 5,969. The numbers continued to climb for the Allies, even as the Germans struggled under the weight of strategic bombing and resource scarcity. The contrast was devastating. For every one Panzer rolling off a German assembly line, 6 or 7 Shermans were being churned out by American factories. This wasn't just about tanks. It was about everything: trucks, jeeps, aircraft, artillery pieces, and crucially, infantry weapons like the bazooka. American factories, repurposed from their peacetime roles, began to produce an astonishing volume of war materiel. The automotive industry alone, which had been building millions of cars a year, pivoted with breathtaking speed. General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler transformed into arsenals, producing everything from tanks to aircraft engines. Willow Run, Ford's massive bomber plant, famously rolled out B-24 Liberators at a rate of 1 per hour at its peak. This industrial juggernaut was fueled by an abundant supply of raw materials: iron ore, coal, oil, and a vast, increasingly mobilized workforce. Meanwhile, Germany, for all its initial industrial strength, faced critical shortages. Its oil supply was precarious, its access to strategic metals limited, and its workforce, increasingly depleted by the demands of the Eastern Front, was stretched to its breaking point. The strategic bombing campaigns waged by the RAF and USAAF systematically targeted German industrial centers, further crippling their production capacity. The German High Command, initially dismissive of American industrial potential, watched in disbelief as the flow of Allied equipment seemed to become an unstoppable torrent. This quantitative superiority meant that even if a German tank was technically superior to a Sherman, even if a German soldier was more adept with his Panzerfaust than an American with his Bazooka, the sheer weight of numbers would eventually overwhelm them. It was a war of attrition, not just of manpower, but of machinery, and in that arena the Allies held an insurmountable advantage. The effect of this industrial disparity wasn't just felt on the grand strategic scale. It filtered down to the individual soldier, shaping their perceptions and ultimately their will to fight. For the German soldier, particularly those on the Western Front, the experience was one of constant, grinding pressure from an enemy that simply would not run out of men or machines. Private Hans Schneider, a 19-year-old infantryman with the 2nd Panzer Division, captured near Caen in July 1944, confessed to his interrogators a profound sense of futility. "We would destroy 2, perhaps 3 of their tanks," he recounted, "and then 10 more would appear. It was as if they grew from the ground. Our Panzerfausts and Panzerschrecks were good, yes, but we never had enough ammunition, and we never had enough of the weapons themselves. They, the Americans, they had a rocket launcher for every 2 men, it seemed. And always, more trucks, more jeeps, more supplies than we had ever seen in Russia, even in the good times." This wasn't hyperbole. By mid-1944, the U.S. Army had distributed over 400,000 bazookas to its troops. Each rocket launcher came with a generous supply of ammunition, ensuring that when an opportunity presented itself, the GY had the means to engage. In contrast, while the Panzerfaust was produced in impressive numbers towards the end of the war, over 6.7 million by 1945, its deployment was often piecemeal, and its single-shot nature meant that German infantry often ran out of anti-tank rounds quickly in sustained engagements. The Panzerschreck, the German equivalent of the Bazooka, was a more robust and powerful weapon, but it was also more complex and expensive to produce, and thus never reached the same ubiquitous distribution as its American counterpart. The psychological impact on German morale was devastating. They had entered the war with a profound belief in their technological and martial superiority. They had witnessed the collapse of France, the retreat of the British, the initial near conquest of the Soviet Union. But on the Western Front, particularly after D-Day, they encountered an enemy that fought with a relentless, almost impersonal efficiency. The constant drone of Allied aircraft, the endless columns of trucks ferrying supplies, the seemingly infinite number of tanks and artillery pieces, it all contributed to a growing sense of hopelessness. The bazooka, in its simple, direct effectiveness, became a symbol of this overwhelming material advantage, a small but potent reminder that the enemy possessed not just superior numbers, but the industrial capacity to sustain those numbers indefinitely. It was a war of manufacturing might, and Germany was slowly, inexorably, being smothered by it. The response from German engineers to the bazooka's appearance was swift and telling. Initially dismissing it as a crude, unsophisticated weapon, the intelligence reports and battlefield accounts soon forced a re-evaluation. The German High Command recognized the urgent need for a similar man-portable anti-tank weapon. The result was the Raketenpanzerbuchse 54, better known as the Panzerschreck, tank terror. First introduced in late 1943, the Panzerschreck was, in essence, a reverse-engineered and improved version of the American bazooka. Captured bazookas provided German engineers with invaluable insights. The Panzerschreck fired a larger, more powerful 88mm rocket compared to the bazooka's 60mm, giving it superior armor penetration. Crucially, it incorporated a blast shield to protect the operator from the rocket's backblast, a significant improvement over the early bazooka design. Yet, even with these technical advancements, the Panzerschreck suffered from the same fundamental limitations that plagued much of the late-war German arsenal: insufficient production numbers and chronic shortages of raw materials. While Panzerschrecks proved highly effective in combat, their distribution was never as widespread as the bazooka, By the time it saw significant deployment, the tide had already turned, and German forces were largely on the defensive, struggling against an enemy that could field hundreds of thousands of bazookas, M1 Garand rifles, and M3 grease guns. This reactive development highlighted a deeper systemic issue. Germany, despite its innovative engineers and skilled workforce, simply could not pivot its industrial base with the same speed and scale as the United States. Its economy, geared for short, decisive campaigns, was ill-suited for a prolonged war of industrial attrition. The irony was not lost on many. The vaunted German technological superiority was, in many instances, being forced to play catch-up to the more pragmatic, mass-production-oriented designs of the Allies. The Panzerschreck, while technically superior, was a testament to German ingenuity, but also to their fundamental disadvantage. They could design a better weapon, but they couldn't produce enough of them to stem the tide. The war wasn't about who could build the best individual weapon. It was about who could build enough weapons fast enough and distribute them widely enough to overwhelm the enemy. And in that contest, the American model of industrial output proved to be the ultimate decisive factor. Beyond the cold statistics and technical specifications, the bazooka and the sheer volume of Allied materiel it represented fostered a profound cognitive dissonance within the German military and political leadership. From the earliest days of the war, Nazi propaganda had consistently portrayed the Allies, particularly the Americans and British, as decadent, weak, and racially inferior. Their industrial output was either ignored or dismissed as inefficient and inconsequential. Hitler himself frequently underestimated American resolve and production capacity, believing that their capitalist system was too self-serving to mount a truly effective war effort. This deeply ingrained ideological bias meant that when intelligence reports of astonishing Allied production figures began to filter back to Berlin, they were often met with disbelief or rationalized away. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commanding German forces in the West, frequently lamented the overwhelming numerical superiority of the Allies, describing the situation in Normandy as akin to fighting with a kitchen knife against a machine gun. Yet even these grim assessments often struggled to fully convey the scale of the problem. For the ordinary German soldier, the reality on the ground was far more stark. They saw with their own eyes the endless columns of Allied vehicles, the inexhaustible supply of ammunition, the constant drone of aircraft. They encountered American and British soldiers who, despite being portrayed as soft and undisciplined, were well-fed, well-equipped, and resilient. The ideological scaffolding that had sustained their belief in ultimate victory began to crack under the relentless pressure of this material reality. The bazooka, appearing seemingly everywhere, wielded by ordinary GIs, became a recurring motif in their increasingly desperate encounters. It wasn't the Wunderwaffen, the wonder weapons that Hitler endlessly promised, but a simple, effective tool of mass destruction, produced on a scale that Germany could only dream of. The irony was devastating. A regime built on the cult of will and racial superiority was being undone by the raw, unglamorous power of industrial production, a power that their ideology had forced them to ignore and underestimate. This was not a clash of civilizations decided by philosophical debate or martial prowess alone, but by the overwhelming, almost mundane fact of who could build more, faster, and get it to the front lines. The legacy of the bazooka and the industrial philosophy it embodied extends far beyond the battlefields of World War II. It fundamentally reshaped military doctrine, influencing the development of man-portable anti-tank weapons for decades to come. Its success demonstrated the critical importance of giving the individual infantryman a potent anti-armor capability, a lesson quickly learned and adopted by militaries worldwide. The Soviet Union developed its own rocket-propelled grenade, RPG series, directly inspired by the German Panzerschreck, which itself owed its existence to the bazooka. The RPG, in its various iterations, would become one of the most widely distributed and iconic anti-tank weapons of the Cold War and beyond, a direct descendant of that simple stovepipe launcher. But perhaps the most profound legacy lies in the strategic reevaluation of industrial capacity as a decisive factor in modern warfare. The Second World War proved unequivocally that a nation's ability to produce, to innovate on a mass scale, and to sustain its forces with an endless supply of material was as critical, if not more so, than tactical brilliance or ideological fervor. The lessons learned from America's arsenal of democracy fundamentally altered the global geopolitical landscape, underscoring the power of economic strength and industrial mobilization. For Germany, the war's conclusion brought a reckoning with the stark reality of their miscalculations. The meticulous records kept by the Allies, detailing their overwhelming production figures, served as a grim indictment of the Nazi regime's hubris and its fatal underestimation of its adversaries. The Wunderwaffen that Hitler had promised, the jet fighters and ballistic missiles, arrived too late and in too few numbers to turn the tide. They were brilliant, yes, but they were luxuries in a war that demanded industrial brute force. The bazooka, on the other hand, was the quintessential tool of that brute force, simple, effective, and endlessly reproducible. It was a weapon that didn't just destroy tanks. It destroyed an illusion, shattering the myth of German invincibility and revealing the true engine of Allied victory, the relentless, almost unimaginable power of mass production. It served as a stark, dramatic counterpoint to the sophisticated German war machine, proving that sometimes victory isn't about building the most complex or elegant solution, but simply about building enough of what works, and building it so abundantly that the enemy is ultimately drowned in a tide of steel and fire.